So we've got a major new development in a case that could reshape when the federal government can be held accountable for botched law enforcement raids. This all comes out of a case where the FBI smashed into the wrong house, terrorized an innocent family, and now the government is still trying to avoid responsibility even after losing a case at the Supreme Court level in a 9-0 unanimous ruling. And now this case is once again heading back to oral arguments this week. So let's break down what is happening in this critical case. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe. Also, I want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is Attorneys on Retainer. When it comes to self-defense protection, in my opinion, AOR is in a league of their own. They're backed by an actual law firm, the Attorneys for Freedom, and they're always trying to give you as much as possible as a member. They're expanding their coverage all the time. They've added things like civil liability coverage, red flag law coverage. They have the 4 guaranteed attorneys for your case and a lot more that they're always adding. So if you're interested, if you want to check them out, you can do so using the links down below. And if you use my code ARMEDSCHOLAR, you can get $25 off of your signup fee. So if you've been following the channel for a while, you know that the Supreme Court recently issued a 9-0 unanimous ruling in favor of a family called the Martins. Essentially, back in 2017, FBI agents executed a pre-dawn raid in a suburban Atlanta area. But the only problem was that they hit and raided the wrong house. Agents were supposed to go to an address that was actually 3 doors down, but instead of actually going to the correct address, they put an address into their personal GPS device, I believe a phone, and it ended up actually taking them to the home of Katrina Martin, where she lived with her boyfriend and their young child. Now, when this happened, the FBI smashed in the front door, detonated flashbang grenades, pointed guns at the family, detained them, and drugged Katrina Martin out essentially half naked. And essentially only later, when they were kind of looking through the home, did they notice some mail on a coffee table, saw that the address was incorrect, that they weren't supposed to be there, and they said, pretty much, oh crap, we raided the wrong house. Now, after having that huge oh crap moment that we raided the wrong house, they let the family go. They explained to them, hey, we have the wrong house. We're going to go 3 doors down, essentially execute the raid against the correct house. And they were looking for some believed gang members who were hiding up in a house. So they went 3 doors down and they told the family, we're sorry, we'll be back to explain. But then again, like I mentioned, they went 3 doors down and executed the raid against the right people. Now, also, one of the things that was the backdrop of how they got the wrong house was the fact that they had kind of scouted the house beforehand, but they noticed that there were no numbers actually on the right house. But because they wanted to execute this raid fast, pre-dawn, without being identified, they didn't double check. They didn't look at the mailbox or double check that they had the right address. They just believed that it was the right location, and so they executed that raid. Now, in response to this incident, the family sued the FBI under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA. The law there essentially allows citizens to sue the federal government when its employees commit wrongful acts. But the government in response claimed immunity using something known as the discretionary function exception to the FTCA, and they argued essentially that the raid was planned and how it was planned involved discretion in policy judgments, and therefore they had this exception. Now, on review, both the District Court and the 11th Circuit originally agreed with the government and dismissed this case that the family brought. This case eventually made its way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in a 9-0 unanimous decision in favor of the family. Now, Justice Gorsuch, writing for the majority, stated that the 11th Circuit applied the discretionary function exception too far. Essentially, it was far too broad, and he ordered that the court there needed to take a fresh look at whether the FBI's actions were actually protected by law. So in short, the Supreme Court said that you don't automatically get immunity just because law enforcement exercised judgment. You must show that those decisions were grounded in legitimate policy choices. Now, here's where this case currently stands. After the Supreme Court sent the case back down, the DOJ filed a new brief to the 11th Circuit, arguing that the case should still be dismissed. This case is now once again set for arguments in front of the 11th Circuit, which is going to happen this Wednesday, March 25th. So the 11th Circuit will once again reevaluate this case based on what the Supreme Court said in that recent 9-0 decision. Now, in this case, the government claims that the agent's mistakes flowed from discretionary decisions about surveillance, navigation, and approach tactics. They argue that no statute or rule specifically dictates how agents had to identify the house. and therefore they claim that the discretionary function exception still blocks this lawsuit. So in other words, the DOJ is trying to preserve immunity by repackaging the same argument that was already rejected by the Supreme Court. Now, the Martins responded and fired back, and they argued that the federal government cannot hide behind the discretionary function exception for basic operational failures. So their core argument against the FBI is very simple. They state that executing a warrant at the correct address is not a policy decision. It is a ministerial duty, something essentially where there is no discretion at all. So federal agents do not have discretion to raid the wrong home. They say that the discretionary function exception was meant to protect actual policy judgments, not reckless mistakes like ignoring the address on a warrant and trusting a personal GPS device. They argue that raiding the wrong home, traumatizing an innocent family, and pointing guns at the family is not grounded in any legitimate federal policy. The Martins also argue that the DOJ's position would also create dangerous consequences. So if accepted by the 11th Circuit, it would essentially mean that any law enforcement raid could be insulated from lawsuits simply by labeling mistakes as discretion. Wrong house raids would be immune from accountability, and victims would have no legal remedy for even the most reckless conduct. That would expand government immunity far beyond what Congress intended when they passed the FTCA, and far beyond what the Supreme Court just allowed in this unanimous ruling. So where does this currently leave us in this challenge? Well, now you have that 9-0 unanimous ruling by the court narrowing that government immunity, in this case talking about the discretionary function exception. They sent this case back down to the 11th Circuit to take a fresh look at this issue, but the DOJ is still trying to avoid accountability. And the 11th Circuit will now once again hear arguments in this case. It's going to happen this week on Wednesday, and they're going to decide whether wrong house raids are protected policy decisions or unlawful negligence. So this case is no longer just about this one family. It's about whether federal agents can be held responsible when they raid the wrong home, or whether the government can always escape liability by calling their mistakes discretion. So the Supreme Court made clear that the lower court here must draw a real line on this issue. And again, the 11th Circuit will have to review this case on Wednesday. So that's where things currently stand in this critical case after the Supreme Court issued that 9-0 decision. I will be listening closely to those arguments this week to see how the 11th Circuit maybe plans to treat this case because of that recent ruling by the Supreme Court. And it's going to be interesting to see, what does the FBI and government argue and what does the family's attorney argue in response based on what the Supreme Court said. So as we get more information, as it develops more, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.